Okay, so we are recording. All right, so are there any other questions? Okay, so I'm about back to full strength. Take me a couple more days, but I'm allowed to come and teach today. So, all right, so let's talk about the application article. Okay, so our order for today. So, what did you think of it? Body recomposition. How did these authors define body recomposition?
Ability to build muscle after spasms.
Yeah, so if you work as a fitness trainer, what's probably the number one thing you're going to hear from people that come to you for help? What do they want to do?
Build muscle and burn fat.
Yeah, build muscle and burn fat. So body recomposition. So typically, if we want to lose body fat, do we need to have a caloric deficit or a caloric surplus? Yeah, okay, so that's the usual recommendation is to lose we'll say fat mass, FM. We need to have a caloric deficit, and then the recommendation to build muscle mass, fat-free mass, we need to have not a caloric deficit, but we have to have a caloric surplus. So we have to have a little bit of extra beyond what our body requires just for maintenance. So we have to provide our bodies with building materials to build that extra tissue. Muscle tissue is metabolically active, and it takes a lot of energy to maintain it, which is nice because if you have more muscle, then you're able to have a higher basal metabolism, and then it's easier to maintain your body composition, especially with your percent body fat. So the caloric surplus is to gain fat-free mass. Okay, but the point of this article is these recommendations don't always hold true. So there are controlled investigations that have shown in the presence of a caloric deficit, we can increase fat-free mass, muscle mass. Isn't that interesting? In the presence of a caloric deficit, we can still increase muscle mass. And what's even more interesting is the article also noted studies that showed that in the presence of a caloric surplus, we can lose fat mass. So it's not always as simple as just calories in, calories out. The other key point from the article is that in the presence of a caloric deficit, studies have noted increases in muscle mass, especially when there was high protein intake in the diet. So if we're saying, okay, we're in a caloric deficit, we're eating less than what our body requires for maintenance, we can still build muscle if our protein intake is elevated just a little bit. So according to the article, an elevated protein intake was 2.0 grams per kilogram per day. So you could take a moment and maybe figure what that would be for you. Just take your weight in pounds, divided by 2.2 to get your kilograms, and then your body mass in kilograms multiplied by 2 to get your daily grams of protein intake. A lot of these research studies depend on the accuracy and validity of the method used to estimate body composition. There were several different methods in this article that were used to estimate body composition. So the gold standard was called a 4C for 4-component model. So we're dividing the body into components. So the 4-component model was magnetic resonance imaging, computed tomography. So I think that was found somewhere on the second page of the article. So MRI and CT scans. So the 4 components were water, protein, fat mass, and mineral content. So that's the most accurate. So then we go down to the 3-component model. So how many of you, show of hands, have heard of DEXA, a DEXA scan? Okay, so that's also a very good and valid way to estimate body composition, but it is based on 3 components. So with the DEXA, you have bone mass, muscle mass, and FM for fat mass. Okay, so then after that, years and years ago, the 2-component model was considered to be the gold standard. Do you remember the 2-component models that were mentioned? A couple of them. There's underwater weighing, and then the whole body displacement plasmography. So it's the bod pod. It's a giant egg-shaped capsule that you sit in. So the 2-component model is based on 2 parts, fat-free mass, as well as fat mass. So simple. So the difference between a 2-component versus a 3-component is that you're not separating the muscle and the bone tissue. So it's based on the density of your body. So you can have 2 people that weigh the same. So say you have 2 people that both weigh 200 pounds. Could it be possible that one person is able to float in water and the other person just kind of sinks like a rock? Can people that weigh the same on dry land have differing abilities to float in water? Yeah, so that's what the underwater densitometry method is based on. How can you tell which person has a lower percent body fat? The one that sinks or the one that floats? The one that sinks, because muscle tissue has a higher density than water. Fat tissue has a lower density than water. So the fat component tends to make you float, the muscle component tends to make you sink. So the balance of those two is how we get your body density. And so once we have your body density, then we can make an estimate of your percent body fat. So it's still relatively accurate. So 4 component, 3 component, 2 component. So then you might ask, well, where does skin fold methods come in? Skin folds are based on correlations with your criterion methods. Skin folds, you're estimating body density, and from that estimate of body density, you're estimating percent fat. So it's 2 estimates, which is where you can lose a lot of accuracy. But what's the advantage of skin folds? What would be the advantages from a practical standpoint? Cheap, fast, yeah. And if you're doing it correctly, are there standards to doing skin folds? You just kind of take a skin fold wherever you feel like it? No, there's standards. And the reason we have those standards is because we increase the accuracy of our estimate. So then some of you are wondering, well, I did the in-body over at the science building. Where does that come in? Well, I'll tell you. The in-body, you're estimating all 4 of those. Estimating all 4 of those components based on the conductance or resistance the different tissues have to an electrical current. The in-body is actually very good. It's been shown to come within about 1% of what you would get on a DEXA scan. So it's a nice, convenient, fast, non-invasive way of estimating percent body fat. Okay, so a couple more points, then we'll go. Okay, so assuming you're in a caloric deficit, but your intent is to build some muscle mass. So muscle mass takes calories. You have to have materials, construction materials, to build this muscle mass. So there was one point in the article quoting from the Slater study. So for the precise energy cost of skeletal muscle growth is not fully known. In addition, we are unsure how the magnitude of energy supply, specifically endogenous sources, pertain to this process. So what those authors are saying is that in the presence of a caloric deficit, we can take calories from our adipose tissue and use those calories to build muscle tissue. Does that make sense? So it's kind of you're partitioning, you're taking calories out of storage and then using those calories to build a different type of tissue, so muscle tissue. So that was their hypothesis. Last couple points. So additional factors. Sleep. Is sleep important in this process of body recomposition? Yes, sleep is so important because that's when your body's actually making these repairs. Stress hormones. What's the number 1 stress hormone when you have a lot of psychological stress? Cortisol. Yes, what does cortisol do? Well, cortisol is a catabolic hormone. So it increases blood glucose levels by breaking down muscle tissue and converting those amino acids to glucose. So why is that a bad thing? Breaking down muscle tissue is never a good thing because that's how you get your metabolic rate. We need to maintain that. Okay. So there was a couple of, there's a couple other things mentioned. So sleep deprivation is associated with negative hormonal adaptations. Negative hormonal adaptations. So mentioned the increase in cortisol, but you also have an increase in insulin. An increase in insulin. What does insulin do? What does it do to glucose? Does it allow for uptake of glucose or release of glucose into the blood? Yeah, uptake of glucose. Okay. Well, the problem with that is if you also have an increase in cortisol, cortisol wants to keep glucose in the bloodstream. Insulin wants to put glucose into the cells. So gradually over time, you're becoming more insulin resistant. If your body is resistant to insulin or becoming that way, what does the pancreas do? It creates more insulin. So gradually you're developing this hyperinsulinemic state, and in the presence of high insulin, it becomes very difficult to expend fat calories because insulin blocks the breakdown of triglycerides. Insulin blocks the breakdown of triglycerides. What are triglycerides? Yeah, that's the storage form of fat in the body. So we're having a hard time with these chronically elevated levels of insulin. We're having a hard time getting triglycerides out of storage where we can use those calories during our activity. So really this whole body recomposition comes back to not just calories that are going in and calories that are going out, but your diet, stress management, sleep, all those things coming together to contribute to this recomposition effect. Okay. So any questions? Okay, so just take a few notes. Like I said, I do post study guides. So just want to get you thinking and some discussion. So we'll have another discussion on Wednesday about abdominal crunches. So there's another good article there posted. You'll want to have that ready for Wednesday. Okay, so is it okay if I erase this part? Okay. All right, so let's do number 3, intro to muscular characteristics. So this is just a general introduction because we're going to keep coming back to discussion of these things all through the course of the semester. So if we're looking at a pyramid and just talking about muscular-related fitness characteristics, so we have 4 foundational characteristics of muscular fitness. So to list those, we have power, can you identify some of the others? I know that you know what they are because as soon as I say them, you're going to say, I knew that. Strength, the other 2, you know what they are. Yes, Eric, good. I like to put that one as number 4. Localized endurance, which is different than cardiovascular endurance. So we're talking about endurance in a localized muscle or limited amount of muscle. What else? You go into any health club in Billings, and this is probably the number 1. Big muscles. Hypertrophy, yes. Okay, so our 4 foundational characteristics of muscular fitness. So each of them unique in certain aspects, meaning that we can take our training prescription and we can emphasize any one of these, but they're not independent of each other. In other words, if we focus on hypertrophy, we also tend to get stronger. Okay? If we focus on strength, our muscles become a little bit more fatigue resistant. So localized endurance improves. If we improve our strength, we can also express greater power. Okay? So let's take just a moment and maybe talk a little bit more about each of these. So how would you define power? If we have a characteristic, then we need to be able to define it and we need to be able to measure it. So how would you define power? Or what are some things that you associate with power? Yes, work. Okay, so work is part of it. Yes, say that again. How fast we can do work is the classic mechanical definition of power. So, in a practical sense, power is oftentimes equated with speed strength. Speed strength. So, to measure it, we want to know force, and we want to know velocity. So 2 things important in the development of power. High force, high velocity, you put those together and you've got power. Okay, so strength is part of that, because how do you define strength? Our capacity to do what? Strength is our peak force, isn't it? Our capacity to exert force. So if we improve our ability to exert force, that's part of power. But moving fast is also really important. Okay, so for development of power, heavy weight training is part of it to begin with, but what's our velocity like when we lift really heavy weights? Pretty slow, right? So eventually we have to transition from lifting heavy weights slow to lifting lighter weights fast. So we tend to develop both qualities of power over time. This is where your really heavy weights come in, and then later on, lighter weights lifted quickly, including our own body weight, that we move quickly to develop power. How do we measure power? How would you measure power if you want to know if someone is powerful or not? How would you measure it, or how would you tell?
When I was a bozeman, we had like strings that would attach to the varmints.
Yes.
The amount of weight you could get in a certain
Yeah.
amount of time. So we'd always, instead of like maxing out weight, we'd max out how fast can you get this weight in a certain amount of time.
We have one of those.
Yeah, I guess.
So in biomechanics, we do a lab with that. It's called a Tendo analyzer. Yep. So we can measure it based on how fast you're moving a certain load, certainly. Okay. What else? What if you don't have a Tendo machine? Those are about $1,200 a piece. What are some other assessments of power that maybe if we could measure this, we can estimate average power or peak power? Maybe in exercise physiology, you did a lab where you were able to estimate peak or average power based on performance in another quality. Levi knows. Yes, yeah, a wind gate. How many have done the wind gate? Lots of you. Okay, so you're pedaling against 7.5% of your body weight for 30 seconds. And every time that flywheel goes around, it travels 6 meters. So we're able to get a measurement of velocity or speed, and then force is how much you're pushing on the pedals. So that works. What else? How many have done a vertical jump test? Okay, yeah. So we can do a jump test. Different types of jumping to assess power, peak power. Most of the jump equations will require entering your body weight or body mass. So someone that weighs a lot but can jump really high, they're going to have a high power output. Okay. All right. So what about strength? We defined it as peak force. Okay, sometimes in a laboratory setting, we might even say peak torque, because we won't go into that, but those of you who've had biomechanics or will be taking biomechanics, we talk about torque, and that's actually how our bodies express force, is through creation of torque. So torque is really a more specific measure of strength. So how do we measure strength? Yeah, how much weight you can move. So that's a dynamic assessment of strength. Sometimes in a laboratory, we might also do an isometric assessment of strength. So isometric means what? Yeah, it's a static action. We're not moving at all. So we have cable tensiometers that measure the amount of force production without movement. Probably the most common, though, in a practical setting would be something like a 1 repetition maximum. So how much you can lift. But usually in those assessments, don't those assessments also involve the lowering part? Yeah. And a lot of you have heard my discussion in other classes about how we can lower a lot more weight than we can lift. So a typical 1 rep max assessment is really assessing the lifting part, not the lowering part. The lowering part is generally submaximal. We can lower a lot more than we can lift, and that gets into stuff we'll talk about later in the semester. Okay, hypertrophy. hypertrophy, muscle size. How do we measure it? Sophisticated techniques, not so sophisticated. Every one of these techniques, we have field assessments that are really easy to do, and we have lab assessments that are expensive and more time consuming, but tend to be more accurate. That's a good one. So assuming we can take a circumference measure, which for different body segments would be a rough estimate of a change in muscle size. With that, we also have to make the assumption that there was no change in fat mass. Where is the subcutaneous fat mass? What does subcutaneous mean? Cutaneous is skin, so subcutaneous would be underneath the skin. So yeah, if you have an increase in circumference, and then maybe assuming that there's no change in the fat component, then yeah, you could assume that any change in circumference is due to a change in muscle mass. Okay. I had a student do a project once where they actually measured circumference changes over time. And to ensure that the change was due just to muscle mass, they also took skin folds. So that's one way of determining whether there was any change in fat tissue under the skin, is to take a skin fold. If the skin folds are remaining the same, then any change in circumference has to be due to an increase in muscle. Okay, so we do have other more sophisticated methods. An MRI is probably the most accurate. How long does it take a muscle to grow? There's been some great studies on that, trying to get down into the muscle itself to determine the tiniest little change in protein synthesis. Because to grow muscle, we have to have greater synthesis than breakdown. Isn't that what muscle growth is all about? You have to have more synthesis than breakdown. If synthesis is equal to breakdown, muscles are breaking down, muscles are growing. If they're equal, there's no change. Okay, so it takes, according to one of the best studies I've seen, it takes 20 days for an MRI to show a significant change in muscle mass. So maybe you're not observing it externally, but for 20 days there would be a significant change. Okay, so moving on. Localized endurance. How do we define it? What's the definition of localized endurance? Fatigue resistance. How many have ever done a push-up test? Okay, well, some of you may work in a clinical setting where a push-up test is a 1-rep max. How many of you have ever had that situation? I have, where you're working with someone that has functional limitations, where a push-up test is more a test of strength than it is for localized endurance. So we need to be specific. So what is localized endurance? So a push-up test for a normal healthy person, what are we measuring? Yeah, how many reps? So it's Each rep is submaximal. So submaximal muscle actions carried over time. So number of muscle actions. What about if it's a static test, like a plank test? And we're assessing time under tension. So it's submaximal muscle actions, static or dynamic, carried over a period of time. So we measure that with reps or time that way. Okay. So just a general introduction to these 4 characteristics. We'll keep coming back to these over the course of the semester in different applications. Okay, so are there any questions on this part? Okay, so what I'd like to do next, if you have the ability to get into your PowerPoint from chapter 4, we'll go ahead and go into that now. So PowerPoints are always posted. I do update PowerPoints as we progressively go through a chapter, but they'll always be there, the most current edition just before class. So neuromuscular responses and adaptations. We're going to talk about all of these characteristics in the context of responses and adaptations. What's the difference between a response and an adaptation? Response versus adaptation. Yeah. Longitudinal changes in characteristics. So we do research that assesses changes in these characteristics over time. Okay, then what about a response then? That could be during a workout, or it could be in the time following a workout, a few minutes or a few hours. Okay, so responses are short term, during or immediately following, whereas adaptations are changes over the long term. Which type of research is easier? Some of you are doing a thesis this semester. All of you at some point will be doing a thesis if you're in this major. Which type is easier? Response. Let me make a suggestion that for your thesis that you choose the response type of research. It's a lot easier. Why is it easier? And I'm not saying that being easy doesn't make it valuable. Yes. The longer a study stretches out, the more difficult it is to stay with a protocol. Okay. So in the broader field of science, what happens a lot of the time is rather than doing a longitudinal type study, we look at acute responses, and then we make a guess about what might happen the long term. Let me give you an example. Let's say that for your research project, you want to use our surface electromyography equipment, and we have super nice electromyography equipment, best money can buy. And you want to look at different lat pull downs. How many different ways can you do a lat pull down? Think about it. Lots of different ways to sit down on a bench and pull a bar. Okay, so lots of different ways to do that. So you want to look at differences in muscle activity based on grip width or the type of grip or technique factors for lat pull downs. Okay, so you're measuring, say that you wanted to look at activity of the bicep brachii, activity of latissimus dorsi, activity of the posterior fibers of the deltoid. And so after all this, you determined that a certain type of lat pull down resulted in the highest muscle activity in the latissimus dorsi. So out of all the lat pull down variations you examined, you found that one of them was the best for activating the latissimus dorsi. So you found that one of those lat pull downs that you examined was the best for activating the latissimus dorsi. So what would be your hypothesis long term then? Couldn't you hypothesize that that particular version of a lat pull down would be best for increasing muscle mass in the latissimus dorsi? It's a fair hypothesis, but did you actually measure muscle growth in the latissimus dorsi? Nope, you did not. So lots of research does that. They'll take a snapshot of an acute response and then make educated guesses about what might happen over the long term. So it happens a lot. Elite weightlifters. There's a lot of research on elite weightlifters where looking at acute responses. Or different populations of elite weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters, powerlifters, bodybuilders, looking at acute responses and then making assumptions about long-term responses based on the unique features of each of their training programs. So acute is more convenient, and it's nice because maybe you can get an idea of what happens over the long term by being able to look at a snapshot. Okay, so as we go through this, we'll talk about acute responses and longitudinal adaptations. So neuromuscular, it refers to the connection between the nervous system and muscles. Okay, so it's this connection that promotes force production. Force in the muscles results in torque across our joints, and that's how we move. So the purpose of this chapter is to talk about all the responses and changes that take place in this connection. All the way from the primary motor cortex down to the spinal cord, out to the periphery where we have that connection between an axon and the muscle fibers. So a unique feature of nerve cells is they can carry action potentials. They can conduct these electrical signals that activate muscle. So in my PowerPoints, anything highlighted in red is really important, so you want to key in on those things. So the action potential is defined as the transmission or movement of an electrical signal along an axon. Just making sure our video is still going. So neurons have three basic parts. I know a lot of you have heard this before, but some of you haven't, so let's just do a little bit of review for some of you. So neuron has a cell body, okay, has dendrites, and has an axon. So like other cells, the cell body is where you have all the organelles. The nucleus, ribosomes, cytoplasm. Dendrites are extensions from the cell body. So a nerve cell can have hundreds of these extensions. So these extensions, these dendrites, are receiving information from other neurons. So there's this whole communication network going on, excitatory input, inhibitory input, that determines whether a neuron will communicate a signal onto the next neuron in line. So the axon is the long projection that carries that signal from the cell body. Axons that are connected to leg muscles can be over 1 meter in length. They can transmit action potentials at over 200 miles per hour, so very quick as they send signals to activate muscles. So this is an oversimplified picture, but to give you an idea, we have dendrites. These are the extensions from the cell body, the nucleus in the cell body, and then the axon. Okay, so the axon has this insulating layer called a myelin sheath, and that's how axons can transmit signals so quickly. It's because of this myelin sheath. Okay, so when an action potential reaches the end of the axon, neurotransmitters are released to the next neuron in line, so that action potential continues to propagate from one neuron to the next. The gap between two neurons is called a synapse. If we look at the gap between a neuron and a muscle cell, that's called a motor end plate or neuromuscular junction. So with training, we can have changes. We can have changes in the neuromuscular junction that allows for a muscle cell to contract faster, to create force faster. And that's important. So with these muscular characteristics, especially with strength, it's not just the absolute amount of force, but something that's probably more important is the rate of force development. Rate of force development. So to have a very high rate of force development, there has to be changes in the neuromuscular junction. So that allows that neural signal to get into the cell faster. So you're initiating tension development faster. Three different types of nerve cells. Okay, so motor, sensory, and interneurons. So those of you who've had this information from me or other professors, what's the difference between a motor neuron and a sensory neuron? Quickly. Which one carries signals to the muscles, to activate muscles? Motor. Okay. So, a couple of different types of motor neurons. We have upper motor neurons that originate at the primary motor cortex. Okay, the primary motor cortex in the brain. These upper motor neurons travel down through the brain stem into the spinal cord, and they synapse with lower motor neurons. So it's the lower motor neurons that extend to the periphery to activate muscles. So motor neurons are sometimes called efferent. Okay, so they carry impulses away from the central nervous system. Okay, sensory neurons then. They sense things about the environment. Touch, temperature, pressure, things that are specific to muscles and joints, joint position, muscle stretch, muscle tension. They bring signals into the spinal cord, and then that input is used to formulate a response. Sometimes those responses are automatic, like when we have a reflex. Other times, responses, we can think about the optimal strategy to respond to the sensory input. So they're sometimes called afferent, and they bring information into the central nervous system. Okay, interneurons are only found within the central nervous system, and they're the most common type of neuron. 99% of all nerve cells are interneurons. Okay, so to clarify, you can see there that's the primary motor cortex. Sits at the posterior part of the frontal lobe, just anterior to the central sulcus. So this is where we have creation of voluntary movement. Over on your right, you can see upper motor neurons originating in the primary motor cortex, descend down through the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla. What happens in the medulla? What's going on right here? So if we have an upper motor neuron on the left, ultimately muscles on which side of the body are going to be controlled by that? Yeah, so actually I think I got that mixed up. So this would be on the right and controlling muscles on the left. So they cross over in the medulla, and then you have the lower motor neuron here. So there'd be a synapse connecting the upper motor neuron to the lower, and then out to connect with the muscle. So this gives you just a little more detail on the lower motor neuron. So this would be the axon exiting the spinal cord and then branching to connect with muscle fibers. So the neurotransmitter that activates skeletal muscle is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, right here, is stored in these vesicles. So this bulb represents one of these extensions from the axon. And so inside these vesicles you have acetylcholine that is released into this junction, this neuromuscular junction, and then binds with receptors on the muscle cell membrane. So the membrane of a muscle cell has receptors for acetylcholine. The membrane of a muscle cell, what is it called? Yeah, sarcolemma. So with training, whether it be on the endurance side or the sprint anaerobic side, you would have changes in this junction. So write this down. Some of those changes could be greater release of acetylcholine. Okay, so you're releasing more acetylcholine. You could have a greater number of acetylcholine receptors. And the area of the neuromuscular junction could get bigger. So more acetylcholine, greater number of acetylcholine receptors, and the area, or you could think of it as size, of the neuromuscular junction could get bigger. So the whole idea is to be able to activate a muscle faster. So we're improving that connection between the nervous system and the muscle. So from a practical standpoint, okay, see Addison? From a practical standpoint, we're developing force faster, and that is directly connected with athletic performance. So changes in the body would be expressed through changes in characteristics important for performance. Couple of key terms here. The primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system is glutamate. Glutamate. Excitatory. That's a good test question. There are two primary inhibitory neurotransmitters in the central nervous system, glycine, and you can just say GABA. Gamma aminobutyric acid, just remember GABA. So I want you to visualize this input from both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters taking place in the spinal cord. So in order to generate an action potential, we have to have enough excitatory input. Let's take as an example this patellar tendon tap test. How many have had this done at least once? Okay. So what's supposed to happen? You tap the patellar tendon, and what should happen? Yeah, you should get a reflex extension of the knee joint. So let's talk about how that works. So Within the quadricep muscles, you have muscle spindles. And muscle spindles respond to stretch, especially quick stretches. So when that hammer taps the patellar tendon, those quadricep muscles undergo a quick stretch. And that quick stretch causes a signal to be sent through this sensory neuron from the quadricep muscles all the way into the spinal cord. All the way into the spinal cord. Now notice that sensory neurons come into the spinal cord on the posterior side, or we could say the dorsal side. So the sensory input is coming in through the back door. We could say the back door to the spinal cord, in through the back of the spinal cord. Notice that that sensory neuron has two branches. One branch connects directly with a motor neuron that leads back to the same quadricep muscle. Okay? So right here, this connection between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, that would be excitatory. That would involve glutamate, because we are sending a signal for this quadricep muscle to do what? Excitation means contraction, so that knee joint is going to extend. That's the myotatic stretch reflex. Okay, now the other part of it. How well does your knee joint extend if your hamstrings are contracted? Not very well. So what do we have to have going on with the hamstrings? They have to be relaxed. So that's where you get the inhibition part. So the inhibition part comes because of this interneuron right here. So this other branch of this sensory neuron connects with an interneuron here in green. And so this interneuron inhibits this motor neuron that is connected to the hamstring. So you have this inhibition with either glycine or GABA going on here with this other motor neuron. So the hamstrings stay relaxed, which allows the knee joint to extend. So this excitation and inhibition all takes place within the spinal cord. So looking at the broad picture, is it possible to get stronger without a change in muscle size? How many of you have increased your strength without a noticeable change in your muscle size? Yeah. The body is more likely to go down that path for a strength gain because our bodies have to use a lot of resources to build new tissue. And so your body is programmed to be as efficient as possible. So what's the most efficient way to protect your body and to make your body stronger without expending extra energy? It's to upregulate the nervous system. So the big picture is that strength gains can happen independent from size gains because in the brain and in the spinal cord, we have an increase in excitatory input and a decrease in inhibitory input. So over time, our bodies are changing to allow us to use more of our available muscle cells. So our brains are good at protecting our bodies. We don't use all of our muscle cells at one time unless under emergency circumstances. So over time with training, our brain allows us to use a few more of our muscle cells, and we get stronger. We're able to excite a greater number, and inhibition becomes less. Okay. So this has to do with motor units. So I know a lot of you already know this definition, so here it is again. So a single nerve cell and all the muscle fibers innervated by that nerve cell. So over time, we're able to access more of these motor units as we grow stronger. Innervation ratio is really important because not all motor units have the same number of muscle cells. Large muscles may have several hundred muscle fibers per motor unit. If we look at the quadriceps as a whole, 4 muscles, we have 1 million muscle cells that make up the quadriceps. 1 million muscle cells. It's a lot of muscle cells. And each of those muscle cells is connected to a nerve cell. It's part of a motor unit. The gastrocnemius. Okay, so just so we're clear, what's the gastrocnemius? Yeah, calf muscle, all right? So contains over 1,500 muscle fibers per motor unit. That's a single nerve cell that branches and connects with 1,500 muscle cells. So one of the key ways of regulating force is simply increasing the number of motor units. So if you have 1 motor unit, that's 1,500 muscle cells. And then if your brain says, okay, you can use 2, then all of a sudden you've got 3,000 muscle cells that are contributing. So we can regulate how much force we put into a movement based on the number of motor units recruited. So over time, you'd be able to use more of your motor units. Fibers from different motor units are intermingled. So what does that mean? Let's take a look. So this is just a very simplified diagram, but you have 3 different motor units. So 3 single nerve cells that branch and connect with a group of muscle fibers. So this allows for the even distribution of force, because eventually the force is transmitted to the tendon. Muscle fibers within the same motor unit have similar metabolic and contractile proteins. So this has allowed us to create a classification system. We have lots of different types of muscle fibers. For simplicity, we group them into 3 categories. So we have type 2X. That's the fastest. They produce the highest force. They're also the most fatigable. That means you get this huge blast of force and power, but they give out quickly. Then you have type 2A, fast twitch motor units. These are kind of in the middle. So they have good amount of power. They also have some fatigue resistance. So they're kind of the intermediate. And then you have type 1 slow twitch. Okay, so these are very fatigue resistant. So can you see how, with identification of these motor units, we can automatically make assumptions about different athletes, what they might possess in their muscles? So you would probably assume that a sprinter would have lots of type 2X, an endurance runner, probably lots of type 1. Okay, and that's been shown to be the case when actual biopsies are conducted to identify what they are. Key point, all or none principle. So if there's enough excitatory input, a motor unit will generate an action potential, and all fibers that are part of that motor unit will contract maximally or not at all. All or none principle. So if we're involving a motor unit, it's all in or it's out. So once we put a motor unit into contraction, all those fibers that are part of that motor unit are working maximally. All or none principle. Okay. So factors that affect force production. The first one is number of motor units. So the more motor units means more fibers, means a greater percentage of a muscle's mass. Okay. Typically, motor units are recruited in a graded fashion. This is called the Henneman size principle. So type 1 motor units are first, then type 2A, then type 2X. This is a really good diagram to show you how motor units contribute to force production. Okay. So this is the recruitment threshold over here. Think of this as the amount of excitatory input needed in the brain to activate a motor unit. Down here, this is the force that is needed, force production that is needed. Okay, so the green ones are depicted as type 1. So for low force activities, low velocity activities, we involve type 1 motor units. Lifting light weights, type 1 motor units. Okay, but then rider goes and does a squat with almost 500 pounds on the bar, and he's got to have this much force up here to get that done. What's happening to the size of the circles as we go from here all the way to up here? Those circles represent the number of fibers per motor unit. So type 1 motor units just have a few fibers. Type 2X motor units have lots of fibers. More force, more power production, faster contractions. So when maximal force output is needed, our bodies are going to take everything we have available. More motor units, all that we have available to do a 1 rep max. For just daily activities, low intensity activities, we might only be recruiting a few of these motor units down here, because that's all the task requires. Well, then you might say, well, what about if I did a 20 rep max set of squats. How many have done that? 20 rep max. You have to be really motivated to do a true 20 rep max. What would you feel like after doing a 20 rep max set of squats? That's the test, isn't it? What would you rather do, a 400 meter sprint or a 20 rep max set of squats? Pretty hard choice. Okay, so what's going on with high rep sets? There's a couple different theories on this. So with heavy weights, it's pretty clear that we have to have almost all motor units all at once. Heavy weights, one or maybe a few repetitions, we recruit everything right away. Okay, it's a little bit different when we're lifting a weight 20 times to failure. To failure is really important. What does that word mean, to failure, or that phrase? Training to failure. What does that mean? You can't lift it anymore. So a 20 rep max, squatting with a weight 20 times, and you can't do 21. What does the first rep of that 20 rep max set feel like? Is it hard? Not really. Okay. So the first rep or 2 or 3 or 4 of a 20 rep max set, you're probably just involving a few motor units. And as you progress through those repetitions, you're past 10 now, and you're starting to get a little tired, you're starting to feel it. These motor units are starting to give out a little bit. So to maintain that set, what's your body going to do? Some of these are starting to get a little tired. You've got to recruit a few more. Now you're up around rep 15 or 16, and you're really starting to feel it, and these are really starting to get tired. What's your body going to do? It's going to recruit a few more. To ultimately, by the end of the set, by that 20th repetition, at least some scientists feel that you're going to get there anyway where you would have been on the first repetition of a heavy set. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying with that? So whether it's heavy weight that you can do maybe 1 to 3 times, or lighter weight that you can do 20 times, ultimately, if it's to failure, you're going to go all the way through the spectrum of motor unit recruitment. Now, these fibers down here, they don't really ever reach failure. These are fatigue-resistant fibers. Okay, so this is where your drop sets come into play. Okay, so we're getting into the science here of all these techniques you talk about. How many have done a drop set or a descending set? So you do a set of, say, 5 with heavy weight, put the weight down, you have your training partner take a little bit of the weight off, and then you pick it up again right away, and you do a few more repetitions. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Okay? Drop sets or descending sets. Okay, so that initial heavy set, you're probably getting most of that motor unit pool. These fibers down here, though, really don't get to failure. So when you take off a little bit of weight, you've still got access to all these fibers down here that are fatigue resistant. So you start off that set, you recruit the whole thing, the whole spectrum, you reach failure, and then you take a little bit of weight off. You can still exhaust these fibers down here with additional repetitions, because these fibers down here haven't reached failure yet. They're fatigue resistant. So that's what's going on with those drop sets or descending sets. Do you have any questions about how that works? So what if you're a really powerful athlete, been training for several years, lots of high velocity type movements. There is some evidence that there's exceptions to the size principle. So for an athlete like Bryn that needs to react and produce force at a very high rate, her body over time is going to adapt to where for her event, she's just going to skip over all of these low force units, and right from the very beginning, her body's going to be trained just to go straight up here. So over time with training, there are exceptions to the size principle where we access these high threshold motor units faster. So the recruitment threshold for these motor units drops. So Bryn can get into these high force units without having to go through all this to start with. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so what are we doing on Wednesday? So we've got our applied reading, and then we'll get into more of this stuff. So, okay. Have a good rest of your day.